Perfect. I guess we'll just sit here. Are you standing up when you talk, or just gonna stand? I'll just stand, sit. I'll just sit. I mean, it's basically a conversation. Yeah, we are recording now. So. Yes. Oh, sure. Absolutely. And if, yeah, we'll just. You need it. I've got a.
No, he's just doing the intro.
He's going to do the introduction. Although they say they are mics. Maybe you don't. Slides, sorry, yeah. Sure.
I don't need this, but I think for the live stream we do, so forgive me. First of all, thank you all for coming very, very much. I really appreciate it. As we were talking about with everyone, we love the Paulists, they're our favorites. Eric Andrews, a dear friend, and through him I know Gil, and it's wonderful to be here. And again, thank you all, especially for everyone watching from the safety and warmth of your home. You're not real Catholics, but okay. Let me just say a few words and I'll introduce the guys, and then we'll take over. I'm the publisher and CEO of the National Catholic Reporter, Joe Ferrullo. And I know many, thank you so much. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with us. We're an independent Catholic paper. We are not overseen by any church entities, lay run. And California's always been a good home for us. So it's great that we can do events here, especially in a place like this. And we're here to talk a little bit, as you know, yesterday marked the 10th anniversary of Francis taking over as Pope. And so 10 years ago and change, just as the cardinals were gathering in Rome, a Catholic writer named Paul Bowman wrote in Commonweal that he hoped that the cardinals would pick someone who was a little bit Californian. And as the LA Times said on Sunday, whenever you call anything California these days, you're in for a fight from one side or the other of the spectrum. But I think we got what we wanted. I think we got someone who was a little bit Californian in Francis. And I think that means who was a little more welcoming, a little more open, a little more tolerant, and maybe a little less judgmental. And he's had to negotiate that and navigate that very, very tricky. I think we Americans have a lot of hopes and demands for the Pope, and I think Michael and Chris will both talk about that. But we have to keep in mind that we're only 6% of the global Catholic Church. So the things that we want may not play in the other 94% of the world where there are Catholics. And I think we see Francis trying to negotiate some of the things that he wants to do, understanding that he has to develop some sort of consensus for what happens. So the next couple of years, as you all know, I think are going to be very important in the life of the Church. You have done an amazing synodality effort here. Or at the very least, you put together a great booklet. I don't know if there's actually any reality to it. But now that process carries forward. There's a synod in October. There's one again in October of 24. And together, one theologian calls it the equivalent of a Vatican III. And where the Church winds up at the end of that process, and how the process continues, I think will say a lot about where the Church will be over the next several decades. So it's an important time. It's an important time for us at NCR covering the Church, an important time, I think, for Catholics all over the world to see how this thing that Francis has started and set in motion, how it plays out over the next 18 months. And in this country, in the backdrop of a 2024 presidential election, with the Catholic running for re-election. So it'll be interesting and fun. Having said that, let me introduce our panelists. Michael Sean Winters, you know him, you love him, is our main columnist. He covers the intersection of politics and religion, which is endlessly fascinating. Michael, as he will tell you, has incredible relationships with many of the bishops here in this country and cardinals, and has a great insight into how the Church in this country functions as well as around the world. Chris is our Vatican correspondent. He's also the chief Vatican analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Chris, in that same way, has a front row seat to what's happening in Rome and how this process that we're talking about tonight, that you've spent so much time working on, how it's playing out there, how it's seen there, and what are both the opportunities and the obstacles to making synodality happen the way it should, and the obstacles that might be in Francis's way in terms of getting his vision put into action. Having said that, I'll leave it to that.
Thank you, Joe.
Just so you know, there'll be a couple of brief presentations by both Chris and Michael, and then we'd love to take some questions.
Thank you all so much for having us. I'm going to stay seated so I can operate the slides here and not put my back out leaning over each time. But what I want to do is just take us down memory lane a bit. I'm going to just talk about the last 10 years, and I'm going to do so through 10 images that I think capture certain themes or moments in this papacy. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Michael Sean, to actually offer some smart and astute observations about it all. But I want to begin with this first image, and I think it's an image that we all know very well. We've seen it a lot in the past few days. This is on March 13th, 2013. It's that moment where Pope Francis appeared on the Central Loggia, shocking the world first by what he was wearing. You know, we see him there in this simple white cassock. He had sort of shunned the red velvet mosetta and the gold pictorial cross. But mostly, and most importantly, this image captures the moment where he really stunned the world by bowing and asking for the blessing of the people of God. And I think it's in a clear signal that that was his focus, the people of God. And in a recent NCR article, Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane said, you know, this moment was anything but showbiz. It signaled that something new was happening. So that's the first image I have for you. The second image, though, is on Holy Thursday, and it's Pope Francis washing the feet of inmates at a prison, but not just inmates, women. He also washes the feet of Muslims. And while it's a powerful image because it shows the Pope reaching out to those on the margins, I also think this image captures the moment where you can say some of the resistance to Francis began. Because the next day, some of the headlines were Pope Francis breaks church law because of the fact that he had to wash the feet of women. I think we can sort of look at this moment and begin to sort of say, you know, the legalism that Pope Francis has pushed back against so much over the last 10 years was sort of began in this moment. This is another photo from that first year in July 2013. In his first trip outside of Rome, Pope Francis went to the tiny, tiny island of Lampedusa off the coast of Italy. And he went there after he had read about a just terrible accident where a boat had capsized and hundreds of migrants had been lost at sea. And he took that wreath and tossed it into the Mediterranean and really just blasted what he called the throwaway culture and the indifference of men and women to the plight of those lost at sea. And I think in this moment, migration sort of became cemented as one of the chief themes of his very young papacy. And it's also the moment when he used the language of a throwaway culture, which I would say is a way to sort of reframe so many of the very neuralgic issues we have around human life, to sort of show that everything is everything is connected, that all human life is valuable. It gave a new vocabulary. Oh. Did you see the last image? Okay, good. Oh. Pardon? I don't think so. Please hold.
The Pope is not a fan of technology, by the way. Just so you know, this is Francis reaching out from Rome and...
Sure, whatever you need. Promising. Okay. Okay. This image went viral. It's a moment from one of the Pope's Wednesday audiences. It's him taking a man with a very sort of visible skin condition and caressing him. And I think it's a moment that really shows us the Pope's willingness to go to those who are suffering, to those who are sick, and literally hold them in his embrace. This man from Italy said that moment was for him like paradise. And I think it shows the art of encounter that Pope Francis so often talks about, and he's doing it so much with his own personal witness. This is a moment that an image that I especially love. It's from September 2015, when Pope Francis came to the United States, becoming the first Pope to address Congress. In that moment, the Pope upheld 4 Americans, Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Martin Luther King Jr. as sort of models that Americans could be proud of and model their lives after. And the Pope, who is not especially trained in English, had been practicing for months to be able to give this hour-plus address in English. And it's a moment that I think American Catholics in particular can look back with a lot of pride on, especially those moments to hear the Pope say in Congress, God bless America. And I think it showed also in this image a rare moment when the Pope had behind him then Speaker of the House John Boehner and then Vice President Joe Biden, the sort of aspirations the Pope had to bring together the entire church to come together and sort of to practice that art of encounter, and he was willing to sort of lead by example there. This is where I get a 2-for-1. I was trying to take 10 photos for 10 years, but I squeezed in 2 images here. These are individuals you may not know, but they're, I think, incredibly important in understanding Pope Francis's interfaith outreach over the last 10 years, which has really been central to so much of his writings and his travels. The image on the right here is the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, who's Al-Tayyab. He's the highest authority in Sunni Islam. And the Pope, over a private lunch one day in Rome, said to him, what can we do together? And the two of them started talking about the need for an authoritative voice from the Christian world and the Muslim world to come together to say that religions can't be used for violence. So at this private lunch, they lay out the plans to draft this document on human fraternity, which the Pope and the Grand Imam signed in Abu Dhabi in 2019. And it really has been heralded as a real turning point for the Catholic Church's relationship with the Muslim world. And I think it doesn't get as much attention here in the United States, but it's important to note that this document has become part of the curriculum in so many schools in the Middle East. The United States has also established a World Day for Human Fraternity inspired by this document. And I think it's a real sort of banner achievement of the Francis papacy. The other image that you're not seeing here any longer is the Pope with al-Sistani, who is the leader of Shiite Islam. It was when he visited him in Iraq in 2021. And it also, I think it shows that the Pope is not just interested in bringing his own house together, but he's also interested in outreach to the Muslim world. And he's, again, done that with tremendous personal example. So much so that in Bahrain in 2022, when the Pope went there, he was with Al-Tayyab and he said, the relationships that we now have between Catholics and Sunni Islam is an inspiration to me as a Muslim leader to facilitate greater outreach with my fellow Muslims, not just fellow Catholics. And I think that is very much a direct effect of Pope Francis's outreach to the Muslim world. I don't know what it means, but you're welcome to. I'm right, so. And we're back. Maybe. Laurie, do you know how this? Let's see. Thank you. Yes, 1 second. Okay. So this over here is Al-Sistani. This next image is of Pope Francis presiding over the Synod on the Amazon in 2019. And I think to really understand the Francis papacy, and I'm sure Michael will talk about this, you have to understand the way in which he's using synodality as sort of the vehicle for so much of the reform that he's trying to initiate in the Catholic Church. And synodality, as I think many theologians will tell you, is one of the ways Pope Francis is really taking so many of the processes that emerged out of the Second Vatican Council and implementing them and sort of instilling them into the very practices of the institution in a more permanent way. And so I think synodality will be considered his great legacy when this papacy is over. And this image in particular from the Amazon Synod, I think is a powerful image. You can see the images, or the materials in front of them, where again you can't see it quite in this particular image, but it was during the Amazon Synod that the Pope was accused of basically heresy, because he had blessed the statues of an indigenous statue in this time. So despite the fact that synodality has become his major vehicle for reform, it's also been what has opened up so much resistance to this papacy. But even so, Pope Francis is undeterred. He often likes to quote the Don Quixote, where he says, "If the dogs are barking, it must mean we're moving ahead." So I think he's unfazed by the opposition that is surfacing. This next image comes from March 27, 2020, early in the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it is, for me, the most powerful image of his papacy, Pope Francis standing alone in St. Peter's Square in the rain, holding up the monstrance and blessing the world, but also putting himself out there and using the language of, putting himself in the boat with the disciples and asking where God is in the midst of this. It's also a moment where the Pope started thinking about what sort of world he wanted to sort of encourage after the pandemic, in a post-pandemic world, and where he began to start writing Fratelli Tutti, his encyclical from 2021 about the need for greater human fraternity. But I think when the history is written on this papacy, this will be one of the most symbolic images that we're left with. This next image is with Pope Francis and Benedict XVI, the first time he came back to the Vatican after his resignation. I think it's almost impossible to understand this papacy apart from the fact that a resignation is what sort of launched this papacy. I think in many respects it both confined the Pope to a certain extent, having to navigate for the first time what it was like having another Pope, a retired Pope, living behind Vatican walls. But I think it also freed him, demystified the papacy to a certain extent. I think it showed you that popes can resign, that popes are perhaps a bit more human, that the papal monarchy is not what it once was. And so I think that the Benedict factor is a huge part of understanding the Francis factor, the Francis papacy. And finally, before I turn it over to Michael, I'll end with this slide. It's an image from Pope Francis's most recent trip to South Sudan. This was in the capital, Juba. And the Pope went there, not alone, but with the leaders of the Anglican Communion and the Presbyterian Church, the Church of Scotland. And these leaders went there to beg for peace after years of bloody civil war that's just decimated and paralyzed the country. They went there together as ecumenical brothers to put aside their differences in hopes that the country's rival political factions would put aside their differences. It's also amazing that Pope Francis is 86 years old and was willing to undertake such a strenuous journey. So I close with this image to show that at 86, he's a Pope that is still going strong. He's committed to the reform that he's launched. He continues to want to travel. Even though he's sidelined somewhat by mobility issues, he said that it takes a brain to govern, not legs. So this is a Pope that, even though we're marking the 10-year anniversary, very much, I think, is committed to going ahead and not being deterred by those dogs that are barking. So I say all this just to offer sort of, a general overview of where we've been. I turn it over to my colleague, Michael Shawn, to say where we might be going, and then I look forward to a conversation together. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I guess the first thing to say is, woof, woof, the dogs are barking. Can you go back to the Amazon picture? Because I want to say something. This is the first time I saw these video slides. So, I'm blocking it.
No, it's your. Oh.
I just want to point out, that's Cardinal Sean O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, sitting with Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez, the Archbishop of Tegucigalpa, for a few more weeks. On the 25th of March, his replacement is being installed. And one of the things that I think is critical to understanding this papacy, and critically the opposition to this pope, is that the American Church suffers from Francis derangement syndrome. Sean O'Malley, I've known since 1994. He is not a liberal. He's a deeply conservative prelate. But he loves Francis. Oscar Rodriguez, who's been denounced as a heretic by some of our right-wing journalistic outlets, has known Sean O'Malley since 1984. So this idea that, there's heretics and there's, the Orthodox, it's nonsense. And that picture shows they're churchmen. They love the church. Do they have some different perspectives and all this kind of stuff? Of course they do. And I think one of the things, when we look at Francis, the first thing that we have to remember as Americans, regardless of our ideological leanings, is how myopic the American church and American culture more generally is, which is we go to other parts of the world and say, well, you can't do it that way. That's not how we do it. Well, as Joe mentioned, we're 6% of the worldwide Catholic community. And so when you go into a synod situation, the U.S. is not going to be dominant the way we are, say, at a meeting of NATO, or even a meeting at the UN, at least of the Security Council, you know. In the church, it's a different reality, and I think there's no other country in the world where you have the opposition to Pope Francis that you have in the United States. And a lot of it has to do with the money that is behind the opposition to Francis and the organization. And there's just no, you don't have it in France, you don't have it in Germany, you don't have it in Africa, you certainly don't have it in Latin America. It is a uniquely American phenomenon, and that's important. This idea that he's hugely controversial and all this, the rest of the world, that's not how they view this Pope. He's the Pope. I also thought it was interesting about how we sometimes in the media get it wrong. So when they announced that Pope Benedict, upon his resignation, was going to live in the Vatican, I was like, oh, that's an awful idea. He'll still be influential. You know, they should put him off in a monastery somewhere if you're going to have an ex-pope. And it was that same Sean O'Malley who said, no, Michael Sean. If you have an ex-pope living in a monastery in Germany, that site becomes the focus and pilgrimage for all the opposition. You keep him in the Vatican, you control access. And I was like, that wouldn't have occurred to me. You know, that was, sometimes the prelates, they're pretty wily. I think I want to go back to, just while we're on these images that were so powerful, I think one of the things that's key for this Pope, where the interfaith quality is so rooted in Vatican II, and it's also an area of much overlooked continuity. Nostra Aetate was one of the really important documents from Vatican II, the decree on the Church's relations with Jews and other religions. And in the wake of that, we had these very powerful images of a Polish and then a German Pope going to Auschwitz and recognizing the state of history, visiting with Jewish leaders on their world visits, going to synagogues and praying. This was unthinkable. I mean, little over 100 years ago, a Jewish boy had been kidnapped from his home in Bologna with the Pope's blessing because when he was sick, the crazy Christian nurse had baptized him. And baptized Catholics couldn't be raised in a Jewish home. And so the Vatican signed off on the kidnapping of 6-year-old Edgardo Mortara from his family in Bologna. 100 years later, in Nostra Aetate. So when people say, oh, Francis is so different from John Paul II and Benedict, on that area of interfaith dialogue, there's enormous continuity. And I think the more we get away from some of the stylistic differences and the very unique way the U.S. Church has perceived all three of them. I grew up thinking George Weigel knew what John Paul II was about, and that John Paul II was an American neoconservative. John Paul II was a lot more interesting than that, and a more complicated figure. The picture of Congress you mentioned, the most important thing was, of course, I know you've had a drought here in California. You just need to get John Boehner, because he was there like crying the entire time of that time. But what I remember most from that was it was pointing the speech where the Republicans in Congress were not thrilled with that speech. And all of a sudden he started talking about the value of human life and scripture, some more language of it, and then he started speaking about the death penalty. And you could just see, they thought they were building up for him to denounce abortion, and he talked about the death penalty. And you could just see the Republican side of the room just go like that. That said, I went back and I found article that I wrote at the time, I thought it was a mistake to go to Congress. It's a very political setting. It's a rostrum where we are used to seeing political leaders. I was not thrilled with that decision. The other thing that I will recall from that visit was its ending, where, and never forget the degree to which popes are reliant upon their staff. You remember at the end of that visit, he was introduced to Kim Davis, the Kentucky clerk, who refused and ordered her staff to refuse to issue gay marriage licenses. Oh, closer? Okay, sure. And so he met Kim Davis, and then on the plane back, he was asked about this. And he said, well, she's a conscientious objector. And people were going crazy. What was this? She was obviously anti-LGBT. But more importantly, she wasn't a conscientious objector. She didn't go to prison or jail because of following her religion, but because she was trying to make other people follow her religion, right? She was the opposite of a conscientious. But he was reliant on what he was told. He didn't know who Kim Davis was from Adam. But the nuncio at the time, who we've come to learn, is a sociopath, Archbishop Vigano, introduced her as there's this woman of conscience, this conscientious objector, she's defending marriage and family, and of course the Pope graciously met her, embraced her, and thanked her, and walked away from him. Fast forward, when all the media erupts about this, and he realizes Vigano had misrepresented this meeting. Vigano was recalled to Rome. You were not in Rome yet, were you? You were no. And it was called, and I'm told on very good authority, the Pope looked at him when he brought him in and said, "You might have told me she has 5 husbands." She had been married and divorced 4 times. And we just had that passage from Scripture on Sunday, right? The woman at the well. So the Pope has a good sense of humor on these things. I think the first 2 images you had of the washing on the feet on Holy Thursday. And remember, he had been elected only about 10 days to 2 weeks before that first Holy Week. There were thousands of people in Rome who had their tickets to Holy Thursday Mass at the Cathedral of St. John Lateran because it had been done there for centuries. And when he said, "I want to go to a prison," that's what I do on Holy Thursday. The Curia Romana, the people who the papal household said, popes go here, and this is what's done, and the tickets are out. And he said, "I don't care. What I'm going to do as Pope is go to a prison." And we saw in that first fortnight of this papacy, this was a guy who was not afraid to become Pope and to start being Pope from the get-go. And the Lampedusa visit, more than any other, showed one of the chief characteristics of this papacy. The idea that the way the church gets to its heart, to its inner core, is by going to the periphery. That there was that great image when the cardinals met before they went into the conclave where he was elected. He gave a talk, and Cardinal Ortega then asked him to write it down. And what Bergoglio said was, we hear in the Scripture Jesus stands at the door and knocks, and we assume, obviously, from the context of the Scripture, that he's knocking to get in. But he said, I think the problem with the church is he's knocking to get out. We have kept him confined, and we need to let Jesus out. And the cardinals 2 days later elected him Pope. And I think they knew what they were electing, and I think he's been true to that image throughout his papacy, that he's trying to let Jesus get out into the highways and byways through us. And as Chris said, the vehicle for this has become synodality. I don't think we know whether he knew 10 years ago that synodality was going to become the apotheosis of this pontificate, but it has become that. And it's bringing together his qualities as a pastor and the idea of the field hospital, closeness to people, his role as a teacher in saying the center of Christian teaching is not our sexual ethics or our social justice ethics. The central part of Christian teaching is God's mercy. And recentering our focus on that And then thirdly, the reformer, who, using those first two, look at the structures we have. Do they serve the church's mission of being an evangelizing church that is preaching Jesus Christ crucified and bringing his, the mercy of God, the Father, to all of us? And I think those are the three things. I wrote a series in the last month about this 10th anniversary, and I said to understand him, the pastor, the teacher, the reformer, and finally with this synodal process, which just saw when we got here. This is amazing. So kudos to you. Kudos to Francis for getting us going on the synodal process, but kudos to all of you for engaging it. This should be a model for other parishes. And I think we don't know where this is going to end. And I'll close on this and then we can turn to questions because we should finish. If we go into the synodal process, we're Americans, right? We think in a linear, we want outcomes, we want, If we go in and we say, well, for it to be successful, we have to have women deacons and married men priests and all that, it will fail. We have to go in and listen to each other, and especially to people with whom we disagree, who have a very different conception of church. Andrew Greeley famously said, the opposite of Catholic is not Protestant, the opposite of Catholic is sectarian. If Jesus can't find a way to express himself in a conservative heart as well as a liberal heart, he's not God. And we're not Catholic. So we have to listen to each other, but the purpose of listening to each other is to really unlock and listen to this Holy Spirit and what the Holy Spirit's calling us to. For this to work, we Americans have to shed some of our habits. Our democratic ethos, this is not a democracy. Whoever gets 51% of the votes doesn't win. That Amazon Synod recommended to the Pope that he ordain older married priests, the viri probati, men of proven virtue, be allowed to be priests even though they were married. And he said no. He said, not because I oppose it, but because you didn't reach the conclusion in a synodal way. You reached it in a parliamentary way. You got enough votes to pass it, but that's not how synodality. There can't be any losers in synodality. And when you go back to Vatican II and look at the vote totals, it was like 2,150 to 4. There was no 2/3. They were virtually unanimous. And I think we've got to aim for that. I think the highest vote total against the document was about 125, 126 against Dignitatis Humanae. And we're not there yet as a church. And the American church, worst of all, we're probably the most divided. So we've got our work cut out. That said, in an ideological age, sitting down with people who are different from us and talking about our experiences may help us to at least get past some of the caricatures and realize that we all love the church. And so long as we were at LMU last night and Professor Nancy Pineda Madrid made this point, let's all remember that we all love the church, even if we love it for different reasons. And that's a key part of the synodal process. So with that, I guess we're happy to take any questions. Chris will bring the microphone to you if you put up your hand. And the only thing is, do be mindful there may be other questions, so don't go on for too long.
I'm going to push back a little bit on this idea that the American church is just the 6%, because if you look at the document of the Continental Stage, the concerns we had were being echoed by quotes from New Zealand, quotes from Israel, quotes from the Philippines, quotes from all over the world. The Holy Spirit was saying the same thing to people all over the world. It was a miraculous thing to see that. And so I think for me, the question is, are our bishops listening to what that Continental Stage document revealed to be what the Holy Spirit was saying to everybody?
Well, as a reporter, I try to take a step back and just sort of do more broad observation, so I'll let you give the opinion. But I think, that is the remarkable thing from that. It's a 45-page document in large intent. And, the number, there are, I think, 114 Episcopal conferences around the world, and 100 submitted what served the basis for this. At the press conference at the Vatican that sort of launched this document, I was there, and that was sort of the resounding, summary from everyone is that, what we heard in Dubai, we also heard in Dakar, and I think that brought a lot of encouragement. And I think, the thing about that document is it's a trust-building document, because I think it's a fair and accurate and honest summation of what was heard. Our bishops listening, I think what we've seen in terms of these continental gatherings that have been taking place is real enthusiasm, real energy. From the bishops of Oceania and Fiji to most recently in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, I think we've seen vibrant participation. The one area that did not have an in-person gathering was in North America. And I do think it is an indictment on the U.S. Church that sort of the wealthiest continent could not manage to have an in-person gathering. I don't think it was for lack of resources. I think it was more likely lack of will.
I think there's an enormous commonality in that, and I think it was very much a response to one of the qualities of this pontificate, which is to really highlight that the role of the pastor is not primarily or firstly to repeat the doctrines of the Church ad infinitum, but to help people in sometimes very difficult pastoral situations, to really recenter pastoral theology, which was not something that was being talked about before Francis very, very much. And I think this is something Cardinal McElroy in some of his recent articles is really trying to say. Like, pastoral theology is not like the ugly stepsister, right? It's an important theological approach that we've lost in the West. I think we very much underestimate the degree to which that we bring it in with the air, like a certain conscience sensibility that there's only one way, that the categorical imperative, there's one way, one answer to problems, where the traditional actual Thomistic approach is here's the teaching, apply it to each of the different situations. And in the process of application, you are going to see differences that would make us uncomfortable, would make certain Catholics uncomfortable today. Where you see this most in translations. 300 years ago, Pope issues a papal bull in Latin. It gets distributed via ship. So it reaches America 6 months later in Latin, and the American bishop says, I will translate it. If you're translating, you are in a very powerful position to put the emphasis here, not there. And then that bishop shares it in the vernacular with his priests, who then tailor it from the pulpit and in the confessional to the circumstances of their parish. All of a sudden, the telegraph gets invented, and the next day, you end up with Pope bans pill. And it's the New York Times doing the editing, not this multi-layered thing. That said, so I'm hopeful, and I agree with you. I'm going to give the honest warning shot. We've got to look at what is happening to other churches with worldwide communion. And the LGBT stuff has broken the Anglican communion. You now have, 17 Anglican archbishops who just said we will not honor the primacy of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Women, in my lifetime, women began being ordained priests and bishops in the Anglican communion. The Bishop of London is a woman right now in the Anglican communion. That did not break them, but the gay issues did. And I think we're fooling ourselves if it's going to be any different for us. And I think this is going to be maybe a cross we have to bear. Bearing crosses should never be alien to the Christian vocation. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think that could be the thing that gets really ugly in this process.
Is Francis a flash in the pan, or is he beginning of a new era? What do you think the implications of his choice of cardinals might be for the future of the church and what comes after him?
I'll give you the numbers and you can say what it means. So to date, Pope Francis has appointed just over 2/3 of the cardinals that will elect his successor. So if you want to just reduce it to a numbers game, it means the Pope, has the overwhelming number of cardinals. He's appointed them. I think the real challenge is Pope Francis has also radically diversified the College of Cardinals. Places like Tonga and East Timor that have never had a cardinal before now have cardinals. And these are men that the Pope have chosen that in many respects share his pastoral priorities, but we don't know what they're looking for in the next Pope. And so I think we have a lot of unknowns there, so it makes it a bit difficult to predict what the next conclave will look like. My personal opinion is that I have a very hard time imagining a scenario in which the next Pope is Latin American, or African, or Asian, actually. I think we may be coming back to Europe or North America. I don't think there'll be an American Pope. I think there could be a Canadian Pope.
Remember, Francis was elected from a room full of cardinals that were almost exclusively appointed by John Paul II and Benedict. So the predictive power of who appointed them is somewhat limited. That said, and I think he has like another 14 or 16 openings in the next year and a half, 2 years, so he'll have even more dominance. One of the things he stopped doing and then COVID hit and it became somewhat impossible, is these bishops cardinals from places that have never had them before and from far-flung places. It's not easy to get from Tonga to Rome. They don't know each other. And so the only ones that they may know are the officials in Rome. Probably not the best dynamic. So in August, when he had the last consistory, he had them stay for 2 days of meetings, closed-door meetings, where I don't think a whole lot went on. They had some presentations about Predicare and the Evangelium, the Constitution reform and the Curia. I think the main reason was to help give them a chance to get to know each other. And so he's trying to correct that, but he has to do that every time. And you left off, you mentioned East Timor and Tonga, but you forgot San Diego. Another city that had never had a cardinal before and now has its first cardinal. Yeah. And so, we'll finish the answer on that. I think we're seeing naming Bob McElroy a cardinal is already having an effect on the dialogue in the U.S. Church. As the Bishop of San Diego, what he said would certainly get attention. He was being published for years in America magazine. And the first time his name was put forward to become a bishop, it was refused because of something he had written in America magazine back in 2008. He had written it in 2004, but I think it was 2008 when he didn't make it through. The fact that this is someone who clearly Pope Francis has shown his confidence in is raising these issues of inclusivity. It drives the other side crazy. It makes them nuts that he's saying this with a red beanie rather than a magenta beanie. And that, I think, is exactly what the Pope intended. I think he knew exactly what he was getting from Bob McElroy, and I think it drives a certain conservative segment in the church quite crazy. Does that answer the question? Okay.
It's hard to answer the question when it's such an unknown.
And I am available, by the way. I look good in white, and I am available. Just saying.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation. This has been so enlightening, and it's a great marker for Francis's tenure. one of the things that the Paulist Fathers have been engaging in for a recent General Assembly is addressing toxic polarization in our church, in our country. And what I'm wondering is, yeah, as much as my leanings may lean a little bit more in National Catholic Reporter, are we seeing any hope for kind of, I don't know, détente isn't the right word, but like more conversation with the other side, so to speak? You know, and maybe I'm just talking about the American church right now. And is there going to be any more room for more conversation and less, you know? All right, and what do you see the odds of that happening or opportunities for that happening?
You get paid to look in the crystal ball, so I'm looking at you.
The polarization thing, it's a challenge. I've been to 2 conferences on polarization, one at Notre Dame and one at Georgetown. One was 3 years ago, one was, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. Obviously, they did not succeed. And I think they didn't succeed for a couple of reasons. But one is, it's an issue you can't come at head on. When I was in seminary, I took confession class, and one of the things the priest said was, you know, if you're doing real spiritual direction, there are certain sins you can't come at head on, or the person will just set up their defensive mechanisms, and you never take a defensive mechanism down unless you're prepared to build it back up, because it's there for a reason, right? There's something wounded underneath. And he said, you know, you always have to come at certain issues at a 45-degree angle, and I think polarization is one of those, and I'll give you an example. And why I think this is a hopeful example. In the Diocese of San Diego, when Bob first got down there in 2015, he called a diocesan synod. And San Diego has the church there there's a large white, military, conservative contingent, and a largely Latino, more progressive contingent. A few overlaps. There are some Latinos in the military. Those people are gold if you're a pastor and you're trying to create some balance. But what really emerged from the conversations, what people were looking for from their parishes, in the military parishes, there were families who experienced the absence of a loved one who had been deployed. And in the Latino parishes, there were families that experienced the absence of a loved one who had been deported. They both wanted the same things from their parish and from their community. This created a commonality that brought that synod together in an amazing way. Now, this is an experience, and I think in a hyper-ideological age, maybe we have to look to experiences to bring us together rather than ideas. The second thing, and I think this does get back to the theme we talked about earlier of you know, how Americans can be myopic. Every Sunday in this church, what do you do every single Sunday? You stand and you recite the creed, which has not a single moral pronouncement in it. Lots of moral implications, but no moral things. What does American culture do to religion, and has done this since the first generation of Puritans? Reduce religion morals to ethics. If we keep it at that level, we will fight, but we all stand and recite the creed. We've got to find a way to recenter our faith on its foundations in our creedal statements, in our scriptural beliefs, and then move to the ethics. If we allow the dialogue around ethics to continue to dominate the discussion, we will be at each other's throats. Because some of us are born with liberal hearts, others with conservative hearts. And Jesus can become present in both.
I have a real heart for the synod process, and I think we've done a great job at initiating it here. My concern is for the synod to work, it's going to have to be not a one-off. It's going to need to be a new way of being church. And I'm hoping maybe the NCR we're going to need to have ways to know how to get past just the first level. You know, what comes next, and then what comes after that. Because it's all new ground for all of us. And I'm wondering if there could be some place where, or maybe it is happening, where people are gathering best practices or something. Because a lot of people, like that we spoke with here, were very excited about being asked. But you still are dealing with, let's face it, the passivity of most Catholics. So they're not going to just jump in and come up with another idea unless they have really strong leadership. So I have a real concern about what comes next for the Synod.
I think there's two parts to that. One is we're seeing how the wave goes up and all the information flows to the national and the international level and then to a meeting in Rome. How does it filter back down? But we're not completely blind to that because we've had these in the Latino Church in the United States, these encuentro processes, which are very good at making sure whatever is decided finally at the national level of encuentro goes back down. Unfortunately, this last one, it got interrupted by COVID. But there are those with memories from the earlier encuentros who can do this and to whom we can turn to for advice on that. There are, I think it's going to, and the proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating, right? Like, if we can figure out how to make sure that the dialogue in Rome is brought back to the national diocesan and parish level, what's happening? We are being synodal. Like that's what that's key to that. Now I lost my train of thought. The other point. We'll come to you take.
I'll just say two very practical things. One, I think an under sort of realized fact is that when the Synod of Bishops was established by Pope Paul VI in 1965 after the Second Vatican Council, it was the Synod of Bishops. Under Pope Francis, it is just now the Synod, period. So to use the Pope's language, it has moved from an event to a process and a way of being church. And that is reflected in its very sort of physical structures in Rome. And the other practical point I'll offer is that the website synodresources.org is the Vatican sort of Synod resource website. It's a tremendous archive of what is happening throughout the world, and that is sort of where the conversation continues online. So I would recommend that site to you.
And I think, the conversation, when a politician says, well, I think we need to have a serious conversation about that issue, it's usually a dodge, where like they don't want to have to take a position. We can't let that be a part of the process. We also have to use this to get past the fact that, at least in this country, people self-select their parishes now. Like if you don't like the one you have, you drive, further to go to one that you like. So overcoming those, to the degree it can overcome the polarization, it's also going to be overcoming these kind of structures of pray, pay, obey Catholicism, which have failed us manifestly, most obviously in the sex abuse crisis. And I do think, what the other point was, we've got, what the synodal process has not done yet so far, and I'd love to rope the priests in on this, is it's reached about 1% of Catholics. And I'm pretty sure the people who responded, like subscribed to NCR, the National Catholic Register or something, they're very engaged Catholics. And I think a challenge for the process is, how do you reach the B+ Catholics? How do you reach the C+ Catholics? The ones who really do want to get to Mass on Sunday, but the kids are sick, or one's got soccer, or I'm just tired because I'm working 2 jobs. And we can't lose them. The definition of Catholicism has always had that kind of here comes everybody, James Joyce sensibility. And it's not clear to me the process has yet reached them. That's where coming back down at the pastoral level, I think that's going to be a key question. How are we reaching the people who don't have the time to come on a Tuesday for an hour-long meeting to talk about what the faith life means to me?
I just want to not wrap it up there, but stop this part and please come over and say hi to us when we're done. But I did want to sneak in one more thing before it gets too late. And I think this is probably the most Catholic thing you'll hear tonight. I'm going to ask you for money. When you Google NCR, sometimes the response comes up, the National Cash Register Company. That's not us. We are independent editorially, and we are also independent financially. And we rely largely on donations. So whatever help you can give us, we appreciate more than we can say. Our colleague Gloria has these lovely blue envelopes with all this information about how much you can donate. If you already do donate, thank you. There's information in them about how you can donate more. Please take some of those, give them out to friends who might be interested. Take copies of the paper and give them to friends who might be interested. I think the most important thing you can do, though, if you don't already, is read us. They're online. Our website is free. There's no paywall. People's donations pay for that. Or subscribe to the paper. Because without that, whatever we do doesn't matter at all. And I think if there's anything we can take away from this, Claire talked about the passivity of most Catholics, and Michael kind of seconded that. This is not a time for that, as you were saying. But this is a time for us to pay attention. And attention must be paid over these next couple of years as this process carries through to see who's involved and how and what's really going on. Right? Attention must be paid. A lot of C-plus Catholics, passive Catholics, not the folks in this room, don't really listen to what's going on. They think, well, look, at those guys, the bishops, they don't speak for me, so I'm not going to listen to them. And then they turn around and they have a Supreme Court they don't like, and they wonder how it happened. Or they turn around and some law passes that seems wildly unpopular, and they don't understand how that happened either. So we have to pay attention. And that's our job as journalists, is to bring to you the stuff that we feel you should attend to, and hope that you can respond to it. But if you could do anything else, nothing else tonight, rather, read us and become informed, because a passive Catholic is no good to any of us for the next couple of years. Thank you so much. And please come up and listen.